Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We've got Dr. Kelly Elander presenting to us from Harding University. He'll be talking about how we can take the distance out of distance learning, leveraging online presence and e-collaboration. This presentation is especially useful for folks who are involved in online facilitation, but also people who are thinking about frameworks for doing research on online interaction around teaching and learning. I was very excited when I met Kelly Elander at the AECT last year. For those who might not know, Emerge Africa became affiliated with the AECT last year, and you can read more about it here. I'm just sharing that link, and folks have the option of becoming AECT members at a very special rate. So back to Kelly. So he coordinates the web design and interactive media program at Harding University in Arkansas, and he holds a BS in communication from Ohio University, Masters in adult instruction and performance technology from University of Michigan, Ph.D. in instructional design for online learning from Capella University. So I'm going to hand over.
All right, thank you very much, Nicola. And hopefully you can all see the slides sufficiently. Now, if you notice, there's the image on this first slide. I purposely picked it because it has kind of an old school perception of distance learning, very much remote locations, connected, very precarious, that kind of thing. But one of the issues that we deal with in distance learning, as we all know, and even as we're connected today, is that sometimes the distance is so far that technology issues become a problem, equipment issues, and then also the fact that you're connected to someone so far away, it may be distracting and it may be hard to follow along, as I think Ofume might have mentioned before. So I'm going to proceed now to the next slide and talk about, in distance learning, I think we've all recognized certain problems that have been so common and so well documented in the research. And we've seen learner frustration, learner loneliness, the sense that they're in a class with other people, but they're not really there. Maybe discontent with the way the information is presented, especially if they're not very technology savvy and that kind of thing. And, of course, a lot of dropouts because they just can't cope, or it's too much or difficult, and so they don't want to continue. And it's a universal problem, and I think it will continue, but we may be able to do some things about it. Now, one of the things that I have talked about in this presentation before is that with distance learning, we can do something about these dropout rates and discontent. And the literature helps us to see that there are some models or theories that can help us to overcome this distance obstacle. And I cite specifically Moore's transactional distance theory, which isn't new but is still very valid. Moravian's teacher immediacy model, which is usually used in the classroom, but I think also would be useful online. And then the community of inquiry model with Garrison, Anderson, and Archer. And those are the three that I'll be focusing on as we talk about trying to reduce this distance between us and our learners. In this particular diagram, we talk about some of the different dimensions by which we're put at a distance from our learners. And of course, there's just the physical distance between us. Sometimes there's a time difference, as we're experiencing even now, trying to find a time that we can meet together that won't be impossible for either of us. There's a distance between the instructor and the learner. The interface becomes an obstacle. The content could be an obstacle. So there are many things that can put us at a distance from our learners. And according to Moore's transactional distance theory if we allow, the more the interaction and the sense that they are connected to the discussion, the more people will lose consciousness of the distance. And if you've ever been in an exciting conversation, or maybe been part of a group where you get so caught up in it, you lose track of time and distance and all those kinds of things. And that's what we're trying to do in order to overcome that distance obstacle. The second theory that I'm talking about here is Mavroidis' teacher immediacy. And when we go to an in-person classroom, a lot of students greatly appreciate the fact that there's a living, breathing human in the room with them, and they acknowledge them, and they can see them, and they can see the subtle motions, nonverbal communication, and all that kind of thing. And it helps them to feel an emotional connection. You know, I've noticed this in, this is kind of off the subject, but in some of my work with e-learning and radio, TV, and that kind of thing, just the sense of being able to look another person in the eyes across the technology can bridge a lot of that distance and make it more personal. Well, teacher immediacy in the classroom often has to do with certain things that we do or say when we're in their presence. But online, it becomes a bigger difficulty because they can't have that direct sense of, you know, I feel you, I can see you, I can smell your perfume, you know, that's not there. So we have to find another way to try to create that closeness. Probably most, oops, let me go back one. Probably most of you are familiar with the community of inquiry model, and it talks about in online learning we have a social presence, we have a cognitive presence where it has to do with the creation of the instruction and the information and how it engages with our mind, and then a teaching presence where the person who's conducting the courses creates a certain connection based on transactions in the learning process. The social presence is the one that I've been most looking at and researching and writing about, but I think we might be able to do a bit more with it. Now, I don't know if many of you have noticed, but the community of inquiry model, there are some blogs with the authors that talk about developments in community of inquiry. And one of the articles that has come out recently with another colleague of the original developers suggested that maybe we should have an emotional presence, that adds something that has that goes beyond social presence. And I think that's pretty true myself, just from anecdotally, but I think it's an area that we need to probe and research and find out more about what that emotional presence is that's different than social presence. But for the sake of argument, I'll show these 4 dimensions here, and you can see the overlaps, and you can see that there's the social presence and the emotional presence that are more psychological, if you will, and then there's the cognitive, which is more about putting the information in a logical organization and being able to present it in a logical way, and then there's the teaching presence, which has to do with the techniques that help us to convey that information. Now, if you take these 4 dimensions, there are, you know, various tests or surveys that we can use to try to measure these dimensions to some degree. But I was thinking about how, since we now have potentially 4 different presences, what if we rearrange the model? What if we took the 2 psychological components, the social presence and the emotional presence, and we put them opposite the more technical presence in terms of teaching presence and cognitive presence? And with this approach, we could put it into a matrix, as you can see in the diagram, and it might be possible then to test a teaching session and plot it in this matrix, which quadrant it's in, how much of one versus another, is it more emotional, is it more technical, and by diagnosing or identifying where this course is in this matrix, Then if we're having problems with the course, we could say, oh, we need to increase more of this component, and then we could take certain steps to try to increase the emotional presence or the social presence or teaching presence, whatever is lacking. So I think it has a prescriptive component if we think of it in these terms. Now, I don't know of anyone that's done research with this or has really tried to dig into this kind of look at the model. You know, when I looked at, I recently read, was it Anderson's book, I think, that just came out, or maybe it was Garrison, and they talked about the emotional presence and kind of dispelled it. But the fact that people keep asking about it and thinking about it means that maybe there is a bit more there. I know they probably don't want to change the model, but perhaps it's time to consider a little bit more with the model. So this is something that of interest to me, and if I can figure out the way to do it, I may try to do some research in this area and see if we could substantiate the emotional presence and then find some tools in order to measure and diagnose these courses in this component. Now, this is all kind of technical, I realize, but from the prescriptive standpoint, if we have a course and we're trying to create a good connection with our learners in a group, we can see the areas that perhaps we need to step up if they're not connecting with us very well. Thank you, Jerome, for that reference. I'm going to look that up. Okay, so I think the real problem with distance learning is the problem is not the distance, but how we manage it. In my own research, I've noticed e-collaboration approaches are very useful, especially synchronous group activities, that kind of thing, which can be difficult and expensive. And the second is increasing our social presence during the learning. Now, as a presenter, we can do a lot to enhance our social presence and to make the learners feel that we're very present and aware and connected to them. And if we're wise and we're careful, we can do this without wearing ourselves out, because, you know, we can't follow around every learner and constantly talk to them, or we'd never get anything done. So how do we manage to kind of shepherd this group so that we can have them feel that we're connected at all times? All right, one of the ways we reduce isolation is by using these collaboration approaches that I mentioned. So if people are feeling isolated, we can use collaboration approaches to make them feel connected to other people and have this interactive communication and begin to create relationships that help them to not look at the distance and see the separation. Just as Moore's theory talks about, the more interactions, the regular interactions, the quality of interactions between learners and the instructor can help to make the whole class seem closer. So during the learning process, we want to engage them and get them involved and have them create a certain community and certain relationships and trust and dependence that will help them to stop thinking about the distance between them. And I've seen this in classes where you have like group activities and that kind of thing, where you get really connected to your own group and you get to know them very well and work together. And I think that is one of the ways we can help reduce this distance. And so the other is creating a community of inquiry. Now, one of the things often we'll try to do some interaction or group discussion, that kind of thing. But the problem is that often it doesn't become a community. And part of what we can do is, if we think about the online session as a community, and these people are all connected in a relationship to one another, and then they work and communicate and interact on a personal as well as academic level, then we're going to build a community, and people will be able to feel more comfortable and feel more emotionally connected with one another. And, you know, Dron and Anderson provided a new, well, it's relatively new now, I think it was 2015, a new book on community of inquiry in social media, and they talked about different groups of all sizes and all social media platforms. And even though you go from platform to platform, there is a sense of community that gets created. I think it's very interesting. So if you haven't had a chance, if you go over to their university website, you can download a PDF version for free. Okay, so what about these e-collaboration approaches that we're going to use to help online learners? There's 4 things that the online learner definitely needs as we look at the literature. Interactivity, there's a lot about that. Human presence, not just, that there's some organization, but actually a sense of humanity in the course. Learning motivation, and then authentic learning settings. Let's talk about these. And interactivity, learners want to express their needs to communicate with others. They need to have confirmation, affirmation, guidance, advice, and feedback. And collaborative techniques and classes provide the channels for these kinds of interactions. I mean, we have our chat running here at the same time. We could have audio as well. We could have video. And then we could even have other platforms going on at the same time, back channels of various kinds, Twitter and so on. How can we provide this level of interactivity in a reasonable and feasible way? Well, one thing is to have occasional instructor asynchronous group comments or observations. Often we create discussion groups or that kind of thing with our classes, and as they comment, they're wondering and thinking, is the instructor here? Is the instructor... Oops, I did something to my PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Getting too involved, I guess. So anyway, so they're looking for the sense that the instructor is there and is present. Of course, in a large class with a diverse audience, we can't be there 24/7, and we can't comment on every single post. But if we look carefully and we periodically appear and speak, then they'll have the sense that we're there even when we're not there. And that's part of creating this environment. And then if we can stimulate discussion between the students, then they have a sense that there are people there and ready to comment on it. Now, there is a problem with sometimes you'll get students that are kind of loners, and they come in at a time when no one else is communicating and so on. But that's part of the teaching presence, is creating the idea that during certain time periods we will meet and talk, and as a group we will move through the material in a logical way so that we're more like a cohort, and we're connected, and we'll always find someone to communicate with. In line with this idea to enhance our interactivity is occasional instructor personal communication with each student. Now, I can present classes or comment on their responses and so on, but if some point during the session I try to connect personally with each student, whether it's through Skype or through social media or a phone call, it creates a dimension of personal connection with that student that will last beyond the time that we have in that one session. So I think that's important for us to make that connection. And we can also use more personalized media in our classes. I mentioned video, and I know video is a problem in a lot of settings because of technology and bandwidth and so on. I don't know how many of you have used a tool that we now have in our university. We're using Canvas as our LMS here at Harding. And one of the third-party programs that we use sometimes is the VoiceThread. And so if you can occasionally do more off-the-cuff kind of communications with your class via VoiceThread, it provides a quick, small, quick video connection. So again, they feel more present and more involved. Now, the research so far hasn't given us significant scientific evidence that this is super effective, but from a personal anecdotal setting, I think it does make a difference, and we need more research to do this kind of thing. I'm sorry if I'm not able to follow some of your discussion going on in the chat. Hopefully you'll not lose your thoughts, and I'll be able to address some of these, but don't want to lose track of what I'm doing here and run us way over time and that kind of thing. Okay, so other things to reduce learner isolation with e-collaboration is to direct the learners to communicate and work together. Now, having group projects is not unusual. It's not new or especially innovative. But if they are working as a team together, then you have a dynamic where they have deadlines and they need to meet and they have to kind of feel each other out, and it's a whole other personal and emotional dimension that they have to have in order to accomplish their work. Now, one of the ways that we can keep them connected and keep this process online with our course is to tie it to the calendar timeline. And that's something that the research talks about, is that there's high ratings for teacher presence simply by having an effective calendar and having a sense that we're moving together as a group all at the same time, so that even though we may be separated through asynchronous communication or distance or different time zones, we can still feel connected and be a part of the group. Also, the idea of discussing or presenting in a group. We often will give people group assignments, but what if we provide an opportunity, say in a synchronous session, for the groups to report out what they found? Now, this gives them a chance to prepare and think about and present their information, and at the same time it creates a very personal human connection with different groups within the class. And so as we hear their voices or maybe see them on video, they become very real to us, and then as we go to other work in the class, we still feel connected to them. This is kind of like the magic that happens in the secular workforce when you have a kickoff meeting at the beginning of a project. There's just something magical about people seeing each other face to face and then keeping that impression of one another with them as they go to other settings. So I think we can do that in the learning environment as well. Okay, the second need that I've identified that learners need is human presence. If we don't feel like anyone knows or cares that we're there, and no one really understands us or thinks about our concerns, we're not going to connect, and we're not going to feel like we're really a part of it, and we're going to get disenfranchised and feel like it's all just external to us and we don't care. Well, recent studies say teacher immediacy techniques can help with this. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the teacher immediacy techniques are very much visual and from the classroom, so that in order to do it online, we have to take a different approach. And I think the community of inquiry helps us to communicate human presence throughout the course, and then some of these informal and non-course discussions between the instructor and the fellow learners can help. Personal communication via Skype or web conference can really help. And learning about our instructors or classmates, having a chance to find out who they are and where they are. And let me see if I have the teacher presence concept here. I guess I don't have them directly in front of me. But teacher presence would be like your gestures, calling people by their own personal name, making reference to their comments, so they feel acknowledged and they feel connected to your discussion. And we can do those same things in the learning environment. You know, often we'll have like a kickoff meeting where we get to know one another. We may set up a cafe or a non-formal communication area on the side. We get to know one another, all those kinds of things. And then being able to speak to others, acknowledge their names and say them to make them really feel like they are there and they are connected. And there are others as well, and if you're interested, I can talk to you later and refer you to some articles. There's also at the end of this presentation some references to some articles that might be useful. Of course, there's also learner motivation. You can do everything perfectly, and if they're not interested and they're being forced to take this course, they may have a negative attitude. So motivation is always an issue, but we as designers, if we are, or instructors, have to look at ways that we can engage them and motivate the learners by setting their expectations, setting the timelines, creating learning activities that will be interesting and engaging to them. And collaborative projects, I think, can help this motivation because it builds a sense of accountability. If you've ever been with a group and you're supposed to do something by a certain date and you're running behind, you feel that strain and that sense that you're going to let them down. And by the same token, when you come through in the clutch and you help them to be successful and they all compliment you, you really feel connected to that group. And you have peer success as well as individual success. So I think that helps the motivation because it's not just you have this additional accountability. When learners drop out and feel disconnected in e-learning, it's often because they don't feel like anyone really knows or cares that they're there. This helps build an extra sense of expectation and accountability. Now, it's possible that some learners may not feel that sense of commitment to the class, and that is an issue. I've been involved in team projects where one team member lets the others down, but the others grow even closer as they work around those obstacles. And I also think some people like to advocate the idea of creating a learning contract with the people in a session. And if we can do that kind of thing and create that environment, that might help us to build on this motivation of accountability. Okay, and then authentic learning settings. There's a lot being written about this. You may have seen things like cognitive apprenticeship and all that kind of thing. Well, authentic learning and authentic learning projects are not new to learning. They use them in the classroom, in fact. But the question is, how do we bring this into the online environment? Because as we all know, nowadays, a lot of people in most industries do work online. They work in teams. They sometimes have members that are at a different location, and they still have to create the work that they need to get it done. So if the students recognize that this learning activity that they're doing with a group is actually practice for what they'll be doing on the job, I think it'll add to the relevancy, thinking of the Keller model and the importance of relevance. So they have their own projects. There's interaction, online meetings, and with this project, if you can make it a very real project that they're working on, and maybe even connect with some companies or some organizations within your community that will actually let you do a real project. So that, let's say you're working for a particular company and your group is going to come up with their marketing plan, or you're going to create for them some new methodologies for doing their work. And then you have a real life person from the company coming onto the online sessions. Maybe they come to the final synchronous presentation of the different groups, and it makes the sense that this is real work. This is not just a course. This is not just practice. This is the real thing. And then the learners feel like it's much more important and valuable to them. Okay, so reducing learner isolation can also happen from expanding our social presence. We've talked about e-collaboration techniques, but sometimes these techniques may not be as socially present as we'd like to. So I want to think about some of those ways, and I've got 6 different practices listed here that have come from the research. Careful course design. Strangely enough, learners see the course as being more connected and more social if it's well designed. I guess it's the sense that this person really went out of their way to try to make sure this course ran perfectly, and that you feel some connection to them, kind of like when someone does you a great favor, or they do something that they did by hand, so it has a personal feel to it. We feel indebted to them, and we feel more socially connected to them. Strategic communication and posts, spontaneous communication, planned appearances, immediacy techniques, here I'm going to talk about it some more, and then vicarious presence. So let's talk about these for a moment. Careful course design. We already mentioned that the community of inquiry talks about course design as part of teacher presence, but it also has a social presence effect And it almost seems counterintuitive, but I think it has to do with the sense that there are people behind this. This is not a robotic system that some company arbitrarily made, but this is a handcrafted course by instructors who care about the topic. And then strategic communication and posts. I mentioned the idea that we can't be there every minute. We can't comment on every single comment. Well, maybe some of you are doing it, but I can't do it, especially if I have more than one course going at the same time. But if I occasionally come in at certain times, and I try to vary the regularity, so it's not just on Mondays or it's not just Thursdays at 10 o'clock, but they never know when I'm going to post, and I comment on their post personally in one case, and then maybe another time I comment on what several other people are talking about and point them towards each other in the conversation. Suddenly, I'm not the only person communicating, and my communication is being multiplied across the class. So I think if we could do that effectively, there's more of a sense that we're there and we're connected, even if we don't post quite as often as they perceive that we're doing it. Okay, and then spontaneous communication. We can say, I think I'm going to post this often, or let me go check every evening. I'll go check what's going on in there. Well, what if just out of the blue we say, I've got an extra 15 minutes. I'm going to go see what's happening right now, and we just comment randomly on people's comments and what they're thinking about and give them suggestions. Then suddenly there's a sense that it seems like I'm there all the time. And to them, I'm not some distant person on a schedule with opening. It's like when you go to a company and we're open during these hours, and if you try any other hours, it's closed. Well, spontaneous communication can give them more of a sense that there's not closed hours, that there's more going on behind the scenes. We can also expand this sense by having others with our course maybe help us. If we have like a teaching assistant or something helping us where they can do a little bit of this as well, then we just broaden this sense. Appearances I mentioned. I'll just kind of go a little more quickly here, maybe to catch up. Sorry about that. Okay, so immediacy techniques. We mentioned that a lot of times they have to do with hand gestures, body language, that kind of thing in the classroom. So, which obviously we're not having right now. The intent is to unlock different new depths to the learning so that it's more of a personal relationship, and then a course becomes more like an experience with new friends than it is a teaching session. And part of that, now one of the things that I know we all deal with is if I have more than one online course and there's all these discussions and there's all this stuff going on in various classes, how does one person cover so much territory? How can we be there and engaged for everyone at the same time? There's only so many hours in a day. So that's why I talk about the idea of vicarious presence. And again, social presence, I believe, has a lot to do with the perception of the learner about the people involved in the course. And the learner, I think, can do various techniques in order to help create more of a sense that they're present even when they're not. And part of this might involve, for example, when they turn in an assignment or they post somewhere, often our LMS systems will allow a little message to say, received your comment or whatever. Well, we could make those messages less generic and more personal and more human. And so then when they're turning things in, they feel more of a sense that someone is responding to them. Now, you might say, well, that's a little bit artificial. And it is, but we can also use our teaching assistants to make comments if it's not about the content of the course, and they're not going to pretend to be somebody that they're not. But often if you are interacting with a course and you turn something in and you get a response, you don't always and it's coming from the teacher account, you don't necessarily know who's doing the talking at that time. So it's possible for teaching assistants to be a great resource to the instructor to help spread out this sense of social presence, to be able to connect listeners or learners to one another and create a little bit better interaction. So I think we do have some ways to do this vicariously. Interestingly enough, I'm trying to remember her name. A researcher at University of South Africa, I believe, did her dissertation on having a course where you have a virtual participant who acts like a peer within the class and helps to supplement the teaching. It was a very interesting dissertation, and it really made me think about the idea of vicarious presence. It's possible that as we go forward, some of the AI programs may also help with this kind of thing, but there's no substitute for entirely human interaction, and I don't think there should be. So as you can see my conclusion slide, there are physical and emotional distance between learners, instructors, and fellow learners, but the key is to manage these things and to make a sense that we do have a connection to the others in the learning session. We do have an emotional connection and a social connection to the people around us, so that the learning session is more than just a class online that we go to and come away from, but we actually engage with the people that we're talking to. We have a relationship with them, and we even keep them in our mind and our thoughts outside of the classroom. So I think that is one of the ways that we can successfully bridge the gap. And as you can tell from some of the mishaps we've had today, that technology can always be an issue, but part of the challenge is that when we create a connection and we do communicate as humans, we can understand what other people are going through. We can understand if they're having difficulties or something's going wrong or they couldn't respond to us because they were sick or whatever. It becomes, we become much more understanding. And I think that's the way we bring more humanity into our e-learning, our distance learning, and how we can make people feel less distance between them as they're communicating. Okay, folks, I'm so sorry to go on.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We actually did have an interesting question a little while back. I'm just going to go back to it. It was around how to, Jerome wanted to know how you set up those, how do you decide on those groups? You were speaking about student projects.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Student project groups? Well, one of the things you can do is as you have the students introduce themselves at the beginning, you make note, keep a record of who they are and kind of what their skill set and experience is. And then you can kind of handpick your teams so that you have the right composition of experience versus newness, certain skills that they may have that others may not have, that kind of thing. And also, as you go through the course and you have people working on various projects as duos, in pairs, or teams, they can find certain people that they connect with and they feel closer to, and then they can self-connect to groups. So
Thank you. Any more questions?
And we can try out either one and see what works.
More questions for Kelly? I'm just going back down the transcript to see if I missed anything.
I see a question here. Can you scale up personal communication? Well, I think the biggest factor with the human communication is time and technology. And if we have the ability to connect more often, that's great. And we may use as a platform something like Adobe Connect or WebEx or
various other Zoom, whatever tools we might have out there. But there's also low-cost tools that we can use, like Google Plus, or the Google Hangouts will allow you to have a group. I think it's up to like 6 or 8 people with video and audio connection. And when you're meeting with these groups within your class, you don't always have to use the same platform. In fact, you can try some different platforms, see what seems to feel and work best, and then there's a big sense that together we're figuring this out. Tony was asking, what about larger courses? Yeah, the bigger the course, the more of the issue, right? Because it's harder to communicate on every level. One of the things that we would have to do in a larger class, just like you would in a physical class, is maybe think about like a hierarchy of interaction. So for example, the instructor may connect with you occasionally, and more connection comes from student leaders or TAs or groups that they're involved in. So we distribute the ability to communicate with individuals over a broader group. Now at the same time, even though the research hasn't said that video is scientifically proven to create a better connection, my radio TV communication background tells me that it does. And so I think if we would do more very human video messages in a larger group, much like a podcast, we could perhaps create a little bit more emotional connection to our users, even in a larger group, because when they're listening to the podcast,
thank you, Kelly. And then I know I've got just one last question, because I know I have often got colleagues who take the facilitating online course. And just a reminder to all that the facilitation online course is running again from July, and applications close on the 30th of this month, so the end of this month. But we often get people from UNISA, which is the South Africa's largest distance education university. And I met a lecturer who has over 1,000 students. They get about, about one tutor. Their ratio is to 150 students. Are they? Well, they're all on the same course, so it can be about, and then they distribute, they allow one tutor per 150
And are the 1,000 in one session?
Is that a, poor distribution?
Oh, okay.
They've actually got really good retention rates. I think at the OE Global conference, they mentioned 68% of their students stick with their courses.
Kind of personal connection. I'd be interested to see their dropout rates and other issues in their feedback from the learners. Oh, that's pretty good. Well, I would think with a group that big, you might think of a little bit different strategy, something more like a MOOC, or having what I do with a lot of my courses is we have different modules as we go through the topic, and when they're in that module, they not only have our meetings and our projects that we do, but I also try to create a lot of resources in that room so that they can do some of their own research and prowling around and looking.
Thank you. And Jerome's got an interesting point. He says the distribution is not always determined by what is best. It's determined by expediency, cost, and availability of personnel. And perhaps with the massification of higher education, it's probably, we see budget cutting, all the time. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the future holds. But just want to say thanks again for your very exciting presentation. You're also going to say something about the strategies. I'd asked something about the immediacy strategy, sorry, where that was from. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Where it's from? Let's see, I have in the, if you look in the resources, I think you'll see a couple of articles where I've pulled that out. You'll find that there have been some people talking about it in the in our
Okay, great. Thank
community.
You.
It would be the more recent articles, and no, maybe not. Well, let me. I'll send you a couple of links, and then you can pass them on to anyone who's interested. But you'll see a list of what the techniques are, and then you can see how you might apply them. Now, also, if you, I think I have, yeah, in the resources, there's a couple of chapters that I wrote. I wrote one on in a book on social media, social presence, where I go into it in quite depth. So that may be available to you.
Cool. Thank you very much. And also just here's the link for folks who want to know more about the Facilitating Online course.
Accounts, I can give you
yeah, so I guess we're all going to be thinking about how we might use these strategies in our online and blended course. Yes, sure. And anyone, it's also if you're on Twitter, Kelly is on Twitter. Just find your handle.
Thank you.
Because we're very into our networks.
Will you be able to provide my contact information if anyone wants to talk to me offline?
Yeah, Elander1.